Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, moms and dads, welcome to The Art of Parenting. This is our 6-week exploration of Jewish insights and wisdom to raising healthy children. And I want to start off, today we're going to be doing lesson 1, which is called the parenting principle. And I'd like to start off by really commending every single one of you on here because I think most of us are at a similar stage in parenting. And between bedtimes or just physical exhaustion or all of the challenges that there are to attending a course like this, and then when you couple that together with there's no technical need for a course, right? We're all doing fine parenting without a course. So the fact that you're here today means that you're here because you want to grow, you want to learn, you want to always be a better parent. And I want to first of all commend you for that. I think that's a tremendous perspective, and it's probably the most important thing that you're doing tonight is even just making the point of coming. Obviously, everything else will be a bonus that we'll actually learn some things and we'll explore some things together. But I also want to wish you a blessing that you should be able to do this for many, many more years to come. Meaning, you should never stop. And I when I say this blessing, I mean this to myself as well. I know there are some parents on here that are older than I, or the age is not what I mean. I mean further along in stage than I. And there are some that are further behind. And I hope that none of us ever stop doing this, because this is not a quest for perfect parenting. We're not looking to be the perfect parent. We're looking to grow in our parenting and constantly be growing and constantly be changing and constantly be adapting and trying to give our children the best and give it our all as we go through this. So that's first of all. Second of all, I have to say also how humbled I am. There's quite a few of you already here in the room, and there's more on the way. I think we have about 20 families that are registered in total. And in other words, 20 couples. And to me, that's very humbling because that you would come and give me 90 minutes of your time, 90 minutes of your valuable time right at the end or during bedtime. It means a lot to me. And I'm going to do my best over the course of the next 6 weeks to try and respect that and value that time that you're giving me, those 90 minutes each week. And hopefully you'll find them to be useful to you and you'll learn something and hopefully even be able to implement it in your parenting. I want to begin by talking about why we're here this evening. I at the risk of stating the obvious, we're all here to learn about parenting, but we're here specifically at a Torah course on parenting, to learn the Jewish view of parenting. And that's what I want to talk about. Parenting is the easiest thing in the world to have an opinion about, right? Just ask any parent. In fact, many people say, I thought I knew everything about parenting until I had my first kid, right? In other words, as soon as we have a child, it seems that everything we know seems to go out the window. And if you have an opinion, you have a strong opinion, then 3 months later, 3 years later, your opinion changes. And it seems to be something that you can find everywhere. And if you didn't realize that there were that many books and that many opinions on parenting, then the moment you became either pregnant or a parent, it started to appear in your social media feed. Because the ads started, right? The targeted ads. Oh, read this parenting guru, read that parenting guru, etc. But why come to a Torah class on parenting? That's what I want to address. I think first of all, at the risk of stating the obvious, the main reason to come to a Torah class on parenting is because Torah instructs us for all areas of our life. The word Torah, as we know, is not the Hebrew word for a history book. It's not the Hebrew word for a book of laws. It's the Hebrew word for instruction, which means it's supposed to be a guide to our lives. In the Zohar, in the Holy Zohar, it says that the Torah is what was the blueprint for creation. In other words, it was like God giving us a user's manual, right? Like when you buy a new car, especially if it's a high-tech EV, self-driving, whatever, one of these new ones. So then it comes with a user's manual, and every once in a while, some sort of icon appears on your screen, and you don't know what it is. You got to go look at the user's manual. And the Torah is supposed to be a user manual to life, so certainly it has lots of wisdom for parenting. But I think there's more to this. I think perhaps there are 2 more reasons why it's so important to recognize the wisdom and the advice that Judaism specifically has for parenting, as opposed to all the other parenting books that there are out there. And number one is that Judaism has a proven parenting track record. If parenting is an ongoing experiment, right, and every parenting method is judged based on its results, then Judaism has a bloody good track record. Why? Because if parenting is about transmitting values to the next generation, trying to get your children to follow in their way, then Judaism itself becomes the best proof that Jewish parenting works. Think about it. We all know the stats, right? We quote them all the time to people. There are 193 Jewish Nobel laureates, right? Which is 22%. Right? When we're only 0. Whatever percentage of the world, right? We have 22% of the Nobel laureates. Now, I'm not saying this was due to their parenting, but clearly a large degree of impact that a person has in their lives comes from their parents. Even the fact that Jews are choosing to be Jewish, right? Judaism still being around, despite all of the reasons that we all know, exterminations and persecutions, etc., throughout the years. Judaism still being around and Jews still choosing to be Jewish means that something is working about the Jewish parenting model. So I think that's something to keep in mind. And another thing to keep in mind, I think, is that Judaism offers a time-tested parenting formula. And what I mean by that is like this. If anyone on this Zoom is familiar with this, I think most of us are going to be familiar with this from our parents' nightstands. Dr. Spock was the premier parenting expert at the second half of the 20th century, when most of us were growing up. And his magnum opus, which is right here, Baby and Child Care, had lots of tips, and many of us were raised on some of those tips. And it was reprinted in multiple editions as it went along, right? And as it went along, what happened was they would correct things that research had shown that previous editions of it were wrong about. So, for example, if you go back to his first copy, and by the way, this is a book that sold more than 50 million copies. Okay, so it had a profound impact on the way children were raised in the second half of the 20th century. But if you go back to earlier versions of his book, he counseled mothers not to pick up their children, their infants, when they cry. Why? Because by doing so, you're starting to spoil the infant, etc. Later versions of the book, he retracted that and he said, no. Research has actually shown that no, the opposite. Withholding a mother's touch can actually lead to aggression. It can lead to intimacy issues later in life, etc. Right? I mean, I shudder even to think about how many people had to go through whatever the experiment was in order to learn that on the other side of things. Now, I'm not blaming Dr. Spock. I think that all of us are doing our best. All parents are doing their best. We're all trying to observe and to react in the moment, etc., etc. But this is all only with regards to one parenting theory, one parenting guru and one parenting theory and the research that he was exposed to, right? In any single generation, there are multiple versions of that. That's not Judaism's approach. Judaism says, let's take a look, first of all, at a godly version of this. Okay, but let's say it's not just godly because it's also Jewish wisdom that's been accumulated over the years, augmenting the Torah itself, right? But it's saying, let's turn to something that's not going to change over time, something that actually Jews have been following for generations. And that's what I think we're here for today. And that's why I think exploring Judaism's approach to parenting is so important. I don't think this should be your last parenting class. I don't think it should be your only parenting class. There's nothing wrong with opening up a good book. You know, today there's other parenting gurus that have become popular. I know one of the most recent rises is Dr. Becky Kennedy. I'm sure many of us or most of us are familiar with her work, and Gitti and I are as well. And many nice Jewish families that are trying to raise children in the Jewish tradition are also using tips from secular sources. And that's not a problem. I think it just does us well to also take a look at what Judaism has to say about this. All right. So with that being said, let's turn our attention to the video screens for a little teaser for today's lesson.
Sometimes parenting is simple. I know what to do, and I know why. But sometimes life is a little more complicated. Whether it's the sugar-coated cereal... No, we're not buying that now, David. Or the candy at the checkout.
I want candy now.
The screams get louder.
I want
Then come the looks.
Hurry up!
We're waiting.
Come on, lady.
Shh. We'll be home soon, and I'll give you... How would you react?
So I'm sure right about now, many of us are thinking how we would react in that situation. But I think before we get to the how, I think it behooves us to talk about the why. And that's the first segment of today's lesson. Today's lesson is going to be split in half. We're going to spend the first, I would say 30, 40 minutes talking about the overall parenting vision, what it means to be a parent, why to be a parent, which we'll talk about in just a moment, the goals of parenting, etc. And then in the second half of today's lesson, we're going to get a little more practical, even though we won't get a chance to really get into all of that, but we will continue doing that as we go along. And we're going to dive into, again, still sticking a little bit more broad stroke. We're going to try and delve into what should be the proper parental-child relationship, what that dynamic should look like. Again, we'll bring some practical examples as we move along, but we're going to leave most of the practice for as we move along. For those of you that are interested, of course, we're going to talk about discipline. Of course, we are going to talk about the balance, for example, between holding a child's hand versus giving them self-independence, allowing them to be independent. Of course, we're going to talk about how to raise competent children. Of course, we are going to talk about consequences, right? How to be able to give feedback to our children that they should be able to grow into proper adults by giving them feedback, which sometimes comes across as negative. We're going to talk about, and then we'll end off the course by talking about the road to adulthood. In other words, finally letting go and allowing those children to actually grow up, and what we have to be doing when they're much younger in order to allow them to move on to that. But all of this is for the remaining 5 lessons. For today, we have 2 goals in mind. Number 1, overall parenting vision, and number 2, an overall broad stroke look at the parental-child relationship and what that should look like, what a healthy relationship between a parent and a child should look like. So, as I mentioned, before we get into the how, we need to talk about the why. Any company on the planet, one of the things they have to constantly be asking themselves is why? Why does our company exist? Why is our product necessary, right? What is it that people are going to benefit from our company? And that they usually start with this at the beginning, as they're founding the company. And if not while they're founding the company, then as they move along, it becomes clear that they need to have a document such as this. Why, right? So before we get into the how of parenting, I want to ask this question. And I am curious to know if many of you have even asked this question. Why? Why be a parent? And so we're going to start with this exercise. It's on page 2. You will not be asked to share your answers, but if you'd like to, you're welcome to. And the question is, why do we choose to have children? Take a moment, take a pen out if you have one, and just write down a reason. What's a reason that we as parents choose to have children? If anybody wants to share, they're welcome to unmute themselves or type it in the chat. Love to hear from you. But I think most important is to write it down for yourself, because as we're going to be having this conversation today, I think it's useful to see where you started. Bencio, you want to give us a reason?
Sure thing.
Why do you think parents have children?
Okay, so for me, I think in terms of G.K. Chesterton's notion of tradition as a democracy of the dead and a contract between the dead, the living, and the unborn. So if you're going to have then this notion of tradition, it requires the unborn, i.e. children who were previously unborn.
So your view is essentially to perpetuate existence? Is that the idea?
Well, it's not just perpetuating existence. It's passing along a tradition.
Right. No, I understand. Right. But that starts with starting off having people to pass that along to. Anybody else want to share? It's a hard question. Everybody on here is a parent. It's okay. I'll give you some of the common reasons that people say. Number 1 on the list, babies and children are adorable. Why wouldn't you want to have children, right? By the way, I actually think that's a great place to start. Why wouldn't we want to have children? Because we're asking this question as if it's like, why not? Like as if it's like an equal. But I think most of us, especially because we're all parents already, we all have a long list of reasons why if somebody's choosing not to have children, why that actually makes a lot of logical sense, right? For starters, they're very needy. they take away your freedom. You no longer have your sense of freedom. You're now fully given over, and you have that responsibility. You brought the child into the world. You now need to take care of them, right? It takes away from our ability to focus on other important relationships, right? Every single one of us had to struggle through that adjustment of the relationship with our spouse has now adjusted to, oh, we're now also parents, and we need to have time for the children and time for the parents, etc. And that only gets worse, or worse is the right word, but it only gets more intense as life goes on, right? Because as children become even older, it becomes even harder to have a private relationship with your spouse, etc. They take up all of our resources, our sleep, our free time, our privacy, our spontaneity, our bank accounts, right? They drain our bank accounts. There's a lot of reasons, a long list of reasons why not to have children. I think we better have a good reason why we're having children to get us started. And that's why I think many people would mention to perpetuate oneself. So generally to play a part in perpetuating the human race, but specifically to perpetuate your line, your family, etc. I think a lot of people will talk about the experience of loving a child, right? The relationship with a child is not something anyone else can understand. If you've never been a parent, it's not a feeling you can explain to people. Some people get really selfish. They say, well, I would like somebody to come visit in the senior home. I once heard somebody say that. They're like, I had children. I want somebody to come visit me when I'm in a senior home, my old age. Somebody should take care of me. But then some people get a little more altruistic, to be a giver in the truest sense of the word. To give to someone else is a very big deal, right? And of course, if you're Jewish, we have to give the number one reason we all have children, which is to stop our parents nagging us, right? That's the one reason. But I think we have to be able to look at most of these reasons, and I would encourage you guys to look at your reasons if you did put down 3 of them, and to actually examine whether these reasons are actually selfless or if they're maybe a tad selfish. In other words, is there an element here where we're actually focusing on ourselves? So if you think of some of the reasons that I just gave, perpetuating yourself, to be able to experience a certain love, so it's almost as if it's not about the child we brought into the world, but it's actually about us. And there's something that we need in this. I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I'm not saying these reasons are bad reasons. I'm just saying I think we have to think about that. And one of the reasons I think we have to think about that is because when this is taken to the extreme, if we have children only for selfish reasons, and people only view children as a product of or extension of their parents' needs, so then I think we end up in a very, very difficult situation. And I think text 1 will give us an example of that. Susie, you want to read for us? On page 3 in your book or in your handout, we have a text from Encyclopedia Britannica, and it's talking about a concept known as patria potestas. Susie, if you can, please.
Yes, let me pull it up on my computer, actually, because I left my other one in the corner. Sorry. Of course, it'll take me a moment. I can't find your email.
That's okay. If somebody else has it and they want to read, that's fine. Bencio, you want to go ahead?
Okay. With shame, my Latin teacher, Professor Louis Feldman, Zochorno Lavracha. Patria potestas, Latin for power of a father. In Roman family law, power that the male head of a family exercise over his children and his more remote descendants in the male line, whatever their age, as well as over those brought into the family by adoption. This power meant originally not only that he had control over the persons of his children, amounting even to a right to inflict capital punishment, but that he alone had any rights in private law. Thus, acquisition of a child became the property of the father. The father might allow a child, as he might a slave, certain property treated as his own, but in the eye of the law, it continued to belong to the father.
This is an interesting text because, just to give it some context here, infanticide, which was the ability to kill your children because you didn't want them, only became a capital offense in Roman law in 374 of the Common Era. A lot of people are shocked by this. We're not talking about abortion. We're talking about a child that was already born. Today there's a whole discussion about abortion and whether a child is alive in the womb, not alive in the womb, when life begins, when it doesn't begin. But I think most people would agree that a child who's 1 or 2 years old off the table. That's just considered murder. But actually, in ancient times, it wasn't necessarily. Why? Why? How did the logic go? The logic went, these children are mine. I brought these children into the world. They're mine. I get to do with them as I see fit. The warped thinking is so foreign to our psyche, to our way of thinking of things, to the value of human life that we have in today's day and age, that I think many of us are abhorred by it. But it's essentially the product of taking, I'm having children for selfish reasons, all the way to the extreme. In the Jewish view, it's actually the exact opposite. It's not that children are your right. Children are your ownership, your product, etc. From a Torah view, a parent actually has no rights over his child. The only thing we have actually is obligations. Let me give you one more example at the risk of being a little bit exhausted with this idea, but let me give you one more example. Historically, one of the things that many societies have had to deal with is the issue of child custody. Okay, today we tend to think of that in terms of divorce, but even if other things happen, right, back in the day, if somebody, even before divorce was as common as it is today, if a child lost a parent, the question was, where does the child go now, right? So text 2a is a textbook example of such a thing from a classic Jewish source. Gracie, do you have the text in front of you? You want to read for us? Text 2a. It's from Rabbi David ben Zimra, who was a noted rabbinic scholar. If you can read for us, please, text 2a on page 4.
Okay, am I unmuted? Yes.
You are, yes.
Reuven's wife died, leaving behind a sickly nursing infant. The infant is under the care of his maternal grandmother, but Reuven, am I saying that right?
Yes, Reuven.
Now wishes to take full custody. Reuven is a pauper and has not remarried. He intends to leave the infant in the care of neighbors when he will need to leave the home. Should the child be placed in his father Reuven's custody, or should he remain with his grandmother?
Now, let's pause for just a moment to discuss this. I think there wouldn't even be a question. The single dad culture is alive and well. There are many single dads out there. Dads have first right to custody in typical American law, right? But if you take a look, Gracie, if you could continue, if you take a look at the response that Rabbi David ben Zimra does, his best to infer from the Torah, you'll see that it actually takes a very different approach.
Okay, response. It's clear that under normal circumstances, Jewish laws grants custody of a young child to its mother, not its grandmother. Nevertheless, if the court determines that it is in the child's best interest to be placed in the care of his grandmother, for she will provide him with affectionate care more so than others, then the court should grant her custody. Even if Reuven shall say, "Give me my son, and I will care for him as I see fit, and if he dies, so be it," that is no one's concern. We pay no attention to this argument. Now, in this instance, it is clear that the grandmother takes precedence over the neighbors who will care for the baby while Reuven is at work. Moreover, even if the father expresses his wish to personally care for the child, the court should reject his claim, for it's in the child's interest that he remain under his grandmother's superior care. The guiding principle in such matters is that the child should be placed in the care of the party that will offer the child the best care possible.
So here is the rationale behind Jewish custody law. I'm not saying today all of a sudden children will be taken away from their fathers, going to their grandmothers. This was a unique case where obviously the father couldn't even care for the child, and he was going to be leaving him with neighbors, etc. But here's the summary of it. Here's the guiding principle of it, as succinctly stated by a modern day halachic authority. Susie, if you can read it for us, please. Text 2b is from a much more recent rabbinic scholar.
Yes. The laws regarding child custody are not intended to benefit the parents, but the children. A son or daughter is not an object over which the father or mother has rights. The father and mother have no rights, only obligations, namely the obligation to raise and educate their children.
Now, nobody's suggesting that's an easy thing to determine. Obviously, the Jewish courts had to spend many hours investigating the scenario on the ground in order to figure out who was best for the custody of the child. But I think the telling point that we're trying to take away from here is that everything is about the child. I think that Roman courts, which were, might have lived at the same time as some of these rabbis, would have said, hold on a second. The child is the property of the father. Why are we giving the child to anybody else? Right? He belongs to his parents. Whereas here, the guiding principle is what is best for the child. I think the Jewish view of parents' relationship to their child is perhaps best summed up with this story. This is a beautiful story from the time of the Talmud. Svetlana, do you have the text with you? I don't know who has the text and who's available to read and who's not.
I do, but I'm on my phone.
Oh, okay, no worries.
Internet. I can't see the text.
All right, that's fine. That's
No,
fine.
I'm sorry.
So for now, we'll cycle around with those that already read. If anybody else is available to read, let me know. Maybe one of the Shebbies want to read text 3. I don't know. Oh.
We will read it.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you, Matt. Text 3, page 6. This is a story about Rabbi Meir, who was a famous scholar in the times of the Talmud. Go ahead.
One Shabbat afternoon, while Rabbi Meir was lecturing at the academy, his 2 sons died. What did their mother Beruria do? She laid them on a bed and covered them with a sheet. When Rabbi Meir arrived home after Shabbat, Beruria asked him, "My teacher, I have a question to ask. Before today, a man left an item with me for safekeeping, and he has now come to collect it. Shall I return the item or not?" "My dear," Rabbi Meir replied, "is not a custodian required to return a deposit to its owner?" "My teacher," she replied, "if not for your words, I could not have brought myself to return it." Beruria took Rabbi Meir's hand and led him to the bedroom. She approached the bed, drew back the sheet, and he saw his 2 children lying dead. My sons, my teachers, he cried. "My sons in the ways of the world, but my teachers who enlightened my eyes with words of Torah." At this moment, Beruria interjected, "My teacher, did you not tell me that we are required to return our deposit to its master? God has given and God has taken. May his name be blessed for eternity." Said Rabbi Hanina, with these words she offered him solace and relief from the intensity of his grief. Of her it is written, a woman of valor who can find.
Thank you, Matt. We are here tonight to try and understand the how to parent in a Jewish way, right? It turns out the how of parenting is a reflection of the Jewish understanding of the why of parenting. From a Jewish perspective, having children isn't optional. In the Jewish estimation, it's not dependent on how I feel. It's not dependent on whether I feel right now the child should be doing this or the child should be doing that, or whether I believe that the child deserves to exist or doesn't deserve to exist, heaven forbid. Starting from the fact that having children is a mitzvah, as every single one of us knows, it's an obligation to have children. But in addition to that, once we have the children, they're not looked at as ours. We are viewed as a custodian. We view ourselves as custodians. God has granted us a child and given us the responsibility to take care of that child. Now, in this most difficult of times, meaning Rabbi Meir's scenario that Matt just read about, he's lost 2 children, and Beruria, his very famously wise wife. Beruria was known for teaching many of the Talmudic scholars. She was one of the wise women of that generation. She reminds him of what parenting is. Parenting is a mission from God for however long parenting tells us. Now, to be fair, did this take away the pain? Not necessarily, and I would say necessarily not. Losing a child is something none of us should ever have to experience, heaven forbid, right? And I cannot even imagine the grief that Rabbi Meir was going through. But it does help to put things in perspective. Hashem natan, Hashem lakach. God has given, God has taken. In other words, he was the one who gave you the child. It wasn't you that made a child. This isn't money that you earned and now somebody robbed from you. This is something that someone gave to you for safekeeping. Take care of it for the time that I have given it to you. And as Jews, we believe that if a tragedy happens, as painful as it is, and as much as we cry our eyes out to God, we believe that God has a plan and God is the one that has taken. So if that's the case, then there must be, and that's the logic that Beruria and Rabbi Meir were following in this instance. So as in so many other areas, Judaism enlightened the world in this area. You know, a few years ago, I gave a course, trying to remember on this Zoom, I think BZ was at that course. I don't know if anybody else was, but it was a course called Judaism's Gifts to the World. There were 6 lessons, and each lesson we highlighted another universal truth that most of the world today accepts, or at least the Western values accepts as a moral value, and we traced its source through history to show how it actually came from Judaism. It turns out this is one of those areas that today many Torah values that back in, let's say, Greco-Roman era were actually frowned upon. Like, for example, there's a Roman historian from that time called Tacitus, and he writes, there's a quote where he writes how odd it is that the Jewish people value why infanticide is illegal in the Jewish realm. He says, and this is a very odd law. Like, why do they value children's lives? Like this is literally the way he talks. And thank God, some of those values today have trickled into the world. That the value of human life and the importance of valuing our children for who they are and treating them as human beings and not just as a children enjoy more and more legal protection and rights. Let's put it that way. There's really another example of selfish parenting and the detriment of selfish parenting, but I don't want to get too exhaustive. It's in the appendix. It's Appendix A in your textbooks, which is on page 16 of your student book. So we'll leave that not for now, but you can read it on your own. Now, obviously, thank God, patria potestas is a thing of the past for the most part. But the reason I bring this up is because this is the most extreme version of selfish parenting. And I think it's important for us as parents to realize that sometimes that same attitude creeps in, this ugly monster creeps in and rears its ugly head in our own parenting, in our own lives. Text 4 is Rabbi Adin Evan Yisrael Steinsaltz. Do one of the domes want to read for us? This was in an interview with the curriculum team that put together this curriculum. Take a look at text 4 on page 8.
Yeah, I'm happy to read.
Go ahead, Sarah. Thank you.
First and foremost, parenting is about love. It is about truly loving our children. And true love means doing what is good for my beloved, not doing what is good for me. Some parents make big plans for their children, but they forget to ask, are those plans really good for my children? Maybe those plans are just good for me and my image as a parent.
And I want to stress, even the best parents are guilty of this. How many times do we discipline our children, or praise for that matter, by the way? This is not just negative parenting, also positive parenting, without considering the child's best interests. For example, we yell at our child because they embarrassed us, right? Or we compare our child to another child, which has its own issues, the comparison, right? But maybe we're comparing them positively, and we're saying, "Oh, my child is so much better than another child," or "You're so good at playing the violin, the child has no interest in playing the violin, but you forced this on the child, and actually they're not interested, etc." Now, much larger conversation, which we'll talk about later, even in today's lesson, but definitely in future lessons, is sometimes to us as parents, as the adult in the room, we have to recognize what is actually in the child's best interest that the child themselves don't realize, right? So playing the violin might go into that category. But let's say that it's actually not in the child's best interest, and we're just pushing it because we always had some sort of, secret desire to play the violin, and we never got there, or maybe we did, and we'd like our child to follow in those footsteps. We have to be very, very careful about these things. Let's take a moment now to do another exercise, which I think will really help us drive this home. Right? Let's take a look at learning exercise 2 on page 9. Okay. One day, your 4-year-old son insists on wearing his favorite outfit to school. Unfortunately, the pants are frayed and too small, and they clash with the shirt he has chosen. What is, and let me stress these words, your normal and natural response, and why? You can put that down if you want. Not going to ask anybody for their opinion, but I think there are many of us that would say that they wouldn't allow the child to go out with that. I think the real question is why, right? And now we can move on to step 2, which is if it's going to be different, what do you think should be your response and why? All right. We're not going to discuss this one. We'll discuss the next one, which is essentially the same idea. But I would love to hear some input here if there's anybody that would like to jump in. Here's the next case. You ready? Your 2-year-old son, your 2-year-old daughter has a meltdown in the supermarket. This is the case from the video. You're getting the look from annoyed or condescending fellow shoppers. What is, let's start with your normal and natural response and why? Anybody want to chime in? We won't judge you. This is a safe space.
Oh, this is easy.
Okay, go for it.
I lean into my child. Stop it now.
Okay, but here, Svetlana, that's a very good answer, but you're missing the crucial part of the question. Why? Why is
Oh.
that your response?
Oh, I would be embarrassed about being
This is what we need to
judged
think.
by, I would be judged by everybody around me, and that's a very harsh critic.
Right. And if different from above, do you think your response ought to be different, and why?
Yeah, I do. I think I should be gentle. There's a reason why my child is, fussing. And I need to be in tune with my child, not and knowing that my child is safe, not obsessing about the thoughts of others.
Right. So let me just add one more thing. I think you did a very good job of answering this. Honestly, I don't think there's any really right or wrong. I think this is just a good exercise to think about. But I want to add one more point to what you were saying, which is I think the why. If we were to start with the why, and then move on to what our reaction is, this question is asking the other way, right? What's your normal natural response and why? What if we start with why? Why am I reacting now? What are my goals in my reaction now? Right now, obviously, we have the luxury of sitting here. Our children are sleeping, hopefully, right? And we're going to discuss this nicely and calmly and sanely. And nobody's saying that we're always going to make the right reaction in the supermarket aisle. But we're all here to learn, right? And I think that if we start with the why, which is why am I responding to this, and I would like to try and have my child's best interest, then I think that's always going to be the best guiding principle. And by the way, Svetlana, that might not change your first answer. It might not change the beginning of the answer. You might still lean in and say, stop that now. But your emotional, which we all know comes through in the way we talk, the emotion with which you say it might change because you're saying it with your child's best interest at heart. Maybe you're thinking to yourself, my child needs to learn how to act in public. My child needs to learn, whatever the thought process is, right? And I think that's the lesson we're really trying to take here. And I think this is a very practical way of applying this idea of making sure that we're not being selfish in our parenting. I think that's the overall guiding principle. And I think we're going to see this principle come into play over and over again as we go through all the different, discipline and punishment and independence, etc. It's always going to be, how do I come to this as a parent who's here for my child and has my child's best interests at heart? Okay. This concludes the first half of our lesson. The overall arching, the overarching vision for parenting. And now we're going to attempt to apply that to the first category of our or the first application of it in terms of practical parenting. We're going to discuss a very important issue where the difference in parenting style and philosophy that we just explored is going to really shine through. And we're going to see the difference between whether we're coming at this with a slightly selfish perspective or trying to be there for our child's best interest. And we're going to start with a quote from Anne Frank. I think this is so telling. It's a child's perspective, obviously, and she's literally giving us parenting tips. Uziel, do you have the text open with you, or one of the Mirandas? Anybody else?
I'm sorry, Rabbi. I'm driving.
Oh, you're driving. No worries.
I can read it.
Okay, go ahead. I'm not sure who that was, but sure, go ahead. Who was that, Susie?
Yeah.
Text 5, please. Page 10.
Okay. So the Anne Frank quote is, as you know, I frequently complained about mother and then tried my best to be nice. I suddenly realized what's wrong with her. Mother has said that she sees us more as friends than as daughters. That's all very nice, of course, except that a friend can't take the place of a mother. I need my mother to set a good example and be a person I can respect.
Anne Frank is complaining that her parent is becoming too much of what we call a peer aunt. In other words, a child needs parents. A child needs parents who behave like parents. And by properly filling our role, we give our children that greatest gift. Our kids don't need us to be their friends. They will have plenty of those with time, but we are their only parents. Sometimes, however, and this is an increasingly common phenomenon, nowadays, we fail to be parents because it's easier, it's cooler, it's hipper, it makes us feel a certain way, and possibly even selfishly, to be our child's friend. But what is a parent? What does it mean to be a parent? Take a look at text 6. And Ben Sion will ask you to read this for us, please, if you can. This is God explaining why he loves Abraham. This is from the Torah all the way at the beginning. Why does God love Abraham?
I love Abraham because he instructs his children and his household after him to follow the path of God by doing righteousness, charity, and justice.
A child, thank you, Ben Sion. I'm sorry,
This
a
is
parent.
right before the destruction of Sodom.
This is right before the destruction of Sodom, but I think that the quote can be taken in and of itself. A parent is first and foremost a child's moral guide and compass. Children learn, they gain knowledge, sure, through their years in school, through peers, through all of that. But they need an anchor. They need someone that is an authority over them. As much as we said earlier that we don't own our children, it's still our responsibility to be the authority over them who teaches them right from wrong. And parents should identify to their children the good and bad around them. Point out, you see that this person is doing, that's good behavior. That's what we want to try to model on. We're here now in line. We're going to wait in line. We're not going to skip the line, etc. All of these things that we tell our children all the time, that is us fulfilling our role. In the Torah's perspective, this is exactly what it means to be a parent. And by the way, I know many of you are like nodding your heads. You're like, oh yeah, obviously, like that's what a parent is, right? But actually, there's a lot of parenting wisdom out there that makes a grave mistake in this region, totally not Torah inspired. Take a look at text 7, for example. We're not going to read it in class, but this is kind of a credo for relationships, which encourages parents to have this. It's just a partnership between the parent and the child, and together, if I do things wrong, you'll let me know. If you do things wrong, I'll let you know. And that's completely not the Torah perspective. Thomas Gordon and others who teach similar parenting techniques, they're essentially considering moral judgment of a child's behavior to be an obstacle to raising healthy children. And from a Torah perspective, the exact opposite is true. It's important, we learn from Avraham Avinu, that we take clear and defined roles in instructing our children and a household to follow the path of God by doing righteousness, charity, and justice. I'm quoting the verse here. And Abraham clearly had a very different view of parenting than some of these more recent techniques. Now, this is not to say that we only advocate frontal teaching. As we go through the course, we're going to talk a lot about role modeling and being in tune with our children and parenting through connection with our children. We're not saying there only has to be distance. What we are saying is, in addition to the closeness, in addition to the love, there has to be a certain amount of distance. We are the parent. We are the figure of authority here. Again, it's not going to be authoritarian parenting. You'll see a little bit of everything here, but it is saying that we need to be the leader here. We do need to take a clear leadership role. There's a fascinating video that I want to play for you now. This is my own addition to the course. There's a fellow whose name is Ethan Metzger. Did anybody ever watch his poetry video? Anybody? It went pretty viral on YouTube, I think. I haven't checked how many views. Ethan Metzger was at a poetry slam in the Bronx. So we're going to watch that now. And I apologize that the audio will be a little bit unclear, because at poetry slams you snap, right? If you're trying to encourage the speaker to move to like clapping at a show. So you'll hear a lot of snapping as it goes along, but I think it's a very, very powerful poem. Let me just make sure the audio is coming through, and please turn your attention.
Give it up for Ethan Metzger. There's someone I know who's slow to commend but quick to condescend, who's reluctant to lend a hand but ready to point and laugh at those who need one. One day I was in school, in class, explaining my Judaism when this person has the audacity to exclaim, you're only Jewish because your parents forced you to be. I mean, it's all fake. You don't pray to God because you want to. You only pray to God because your parents made you think you have to. You don't keep any of the laws of your own free will. Your parents just made you feel guilty that you didn't keep them. My classmates smirked. Your parents brainwashed you your whole life, made you think you were doing God's work, but they were just imposing restriction upon restriction. You don't have any real conviction of your own. You don't really know anything about anything. A silence swept over the classroom, and I could sense all my friends look at me as to how I would react. I felt like this fear went after me, and more importantly, my parents. Excuse me, I thought. My parents brainwashed me. I had to think of a response, but the more I thought, the more I realized that the student actually had a very valid argument. I thought to myself, you're absolutely right. My parents did brainwash me. From the time I entered this world, my parents brainwashed me. As early as I can remember, my parents were brainwashing me to have respect for other people, for their belongings, and for myself. Since I was little, they corrupted me into thinking that I need to treat everyone else the way I would want to be treated, no matter what. My parents programmed me into believing that I should stand up for someone if that person were being picked on, that I shouldn't be a bystander if I could stop the evil from taking place. My parents brainwashed me? Yeah. My father twisted my infant brain in such a horrific way that he made me value my integrity. And to make matters even worse, he led by example. And my mom, she incessantly told me as a child again and again and again to just do the best you can. And that idea has now become so ingrained in my mind that I don't define success as whether I get an A or win the game, but as to give it my all. My parents perverted my way of thinking, causing me to believe that I need to be accepting of other people and their beliefs. They contaminated my childhood with mottos and maxims and lessons about love and faith and character, and yes, religion too. And I'm sorry for you that your parents clearly didn't infect your DNA with any of these ideals. But I didn't say any of that, because my parents also polluted my conscience to believing that I shouldn't judge someone until I've walked a mile in their shoes, which it makes me think that God must run millions of marathons each day, and quite frankly, I don't have the stamina for that. But here's what I did say. You can call it brainwashing if you want. That's fine. I call it teaching. Thank you.
I think that's such a powerful statement, because too often we think to ourselves, how can I get down and be there with my child, and we want to connect with our children, and that those are good things. It's good that we want to connect with our children, we want to relate with our children, etc. But we have to remember that while we're doing that, like we're playing a game with our child, there has to be a clear definition of the fact that we are their parent. I want to take a moment to apologize. During the video, I went to go check the chat, and for some reason, it wasn't notifying me when the messages were coming in. I see that some people were answering while I was asking for feedback in the chat, and I didn't notice it at the time. But let me take a moment now to address, I think Ben Sion mentioned something in the chat. He mentioned that Thomas Gordon's approach, this idea of parents and children having a nice relationship, kind of reflects more of maybe an adult-child's relationship with their parents. So let's say you're in your 30s. Most of us, like our relationships, hopefully many of us are lucky to have our parents still alive, and our relationships with our parents. And while I agree with you to a degree, Ben Sion, I think still the Torah would say that our relationship with our parents still needs to be different, as we're about to learn as we dive into the 5th of the 10 commandments, which is honoring your parents. And I think, thank God I don't have personal experience with this, but I think that anybody who has lost a parent will likely tell you that. They'll speak of a longing of missing. I obviously know many people that have lost parents, and they talk about missing their parents, not as if, oh, they lost a very good friend, as if there's no one in the world that can ever fill that role. Because even as adult parents, of course, the relationship evolves and changes. It does from 2 to 8, and from 8 to 16, and from 16 to 25, and then throughout adulthood. But I think still the role of a parent, even as it becomes a little bit more of an adult relationship, or a lot more of an adult relationship, it still becomes the relationship of a parent and a child, and the parent taking the guiding role to their children. And I think if we think about our relationships with our parents, we'll discover that. And that's because of the 5th of the 10 commandments. The Torah's tools for a healthy relationship, the Torah's tools for what it means to have a relationship with parents, for children to have a relationship with parents, are essentially broken up into 2 tools. And they are Kabed et avicha v'et imecha. They are text 8 and text 9a. Kabed et avicha v'et imecha. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days should be lengthened. And ish imo v'aviv tiro, each person shall revere his mother and father. So there are 2 elements to our relationship with our parents. And you'll notice love is not here. Of course, it's important for us to love our parents, but that's not an obligation that the Torah gives us. The Torah gives us an obligation to honor our parents. And I recognize that for those that have more complicated relationships with their parents, if there was abuse present or something like that, obviously that's a different story, and halacha discusses that. But let's, at least for now, talk in most parenting relationships, right? Hopefully a healthy relationship. There's an obligation to respect our parents, and then there's an obligation to revere our parents. And I think that second one is worth spending some time on unpacking. Text 9b, Gracie, if you can read for us again, please, is a quote from the Talmud. Okay, and the Talmud is discussing what does it look like to revere your parents. Because remember, this is like almost like fear. This is having a certain distance from your parents. Honoring is a certain closeness. But now we're talking about a certain distance that you have to have. Go ahead.
Reverence implies that one may not stand in a place designated for one's parent to stand, or sit in a place designated for one's parent to sit. One may not contradict a parent nor express a view in an instance where others disagree with a parent's opinion.
First of all, I want to just mention that in the Hebrew, the pronouns, for lack of a better word, that are used for the parent here are in the masculine, but it's clarified very clearly in halacha that this applies both to a father and a mother. This applies to both parents. And as halacha goes through this, halacha talks about a number of other things. We're not supposed to address a parent by their name. I think that's fairly common. That people call their parents father, mother, mom, dad, etc., as opposed to calling them by their name. But I was going to share a funny story about my son, but this is being recorded. Maybe I'll keep that for another time. You're all welcome to ask me in person. But in addition to this, you're not supposed to contradict a parent's opinion. And there's discussion about whether that's only in the presence of the parent, or even when the parent is not present, not to contradict the parent's opinion, etc., even if the parent is wrong. And of course, rising when a parent enters the room. The underlying foundation of this obligation of mora, which means fear or reverence of our parents, is essentially a way to maintain the parent's prestige. From a Torah perspective, there is a hierarchy to the family. And parents find themselves firmly in the leadership position at the top of that hierarchy. And not only that, all of these laws are meant to highlight the spiritual gulf, the distance that there is between the parental role and the child's role. Now, that's not to say that there shouldn't be closeness between parent and child. There can be closeness, but there also needs to be distance. Allow me to explain. This is not the only relationship that needs this. In fact, I would argue that every single healthy relationship needs closeness, but also needs distance. We're all married, right? We've all been in close relationships. We all know that if there's only love, that's not a sustainable relationship. Right now, it feels very good. Eventually, it'll just feel clingy. It'll just feel like I don't have my space, etc. Right? A healthy relationship is a combination of love and respect. I'm talking now about a spousal relationship, right? In other words, I love my wife, but I respect the fact that she is a separate human being than me. She has her own needs, her own emotional needs, her own physical needs, her own space. She needs her own space physically, emotionally, etc., right? Mentally. And we are two separate beings having a relationship, and that's what love is, right? The moment the respect is gone from the relationship, and we're all just expected to think alike and be alike, etc., now you may as well have a relationship with yourself. That's the closest thing to you, right? So a healthy relationship always has a certain amount of distance, which then brings closeness together. And a child-parent relationship is the same way. I think the reason that this Thomas Gordon and others like him have kind of taken this and thrown this out of the window is because we're not used to thinking this way. Like the moment I say, oh, there's a leadership role and there's a certain authority to the parent, etc., maybe I would even throw in the word dictator. You know what I mean? We're like allergic to a lot of these words. You know why? Because in Western society, and for good reason, we don't like those words because we like words like democracy and equality and liberty. But we have to remember that the family unit is not a government. It's not a kibbutz. It's not we're all in this together and everybody's got an opinion. No. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this, but if you take a look, one example is in Grace After Meals. But really, anytime that a parent is referred to, like anywhere in Jewish literature, you see someone referring to their parent, the term used is avi mori or imi morati. So avi means my father, like Abba, right? And imi means my mother, like imi, right? Like ima, so imi. And mori or morati means my master, my teacher. It's fascinating, my mentor. That's what, every time we talk about our parents. For example, if at the Torah a Misha Berach is given for someone, and they want to say that Misha Berach should be given, let's say, to their father, they say Avi Mori, for my father, my mentor. There's a certain distance. You know, I debated showing the video. There's a clip about this, but people became aware of this after the Rebbe's lifetime. That Rebbetzin Chana had confided. Rebbetzin Chana is the Rebbe's mother, and she came over from France. I mean, she escaped the war, and she came over from France in 1947. Eventually, made it to the U.S. And she lived on President Street, same block I grew up on. She grew up on the same block. Well, not she grew up. She lived after the war on the same block that I grew up on, and not in my lifetime, obviously. This was way later. The Rebbe would go visit her every day, and years later, before she passed away, the Rebbe's mother shared that she had never seen her sons back. Because anytime he would leave her presence, he would figure out a way to like adjust things on the shelf and move things around, you know, giving excuses so that he shouldn't have his back to his mother. Now, from a Jewish perspective, that's not an obligation, number one. Number two, the only place that is an obligation is with the Torah. When the Torah is in the room, you're not supposed to show your back to the Torah. So, for example, let's say they're reading the Torah, so those that are in the front of the shul are supposed to turn a little bit so their side is facing the Torah, not their back, right? This is the reverence. This was the divide, so to speak, the distance. This is not to say the Rebbe didn't love his mother, right? Obviously, the Rebbe loved his mother. But this is to show that children need and want, and a healthy view from the Torah's perspective of a relationship between parents is that the parent should actually have a leadership role over the children. So let's look at some of the ways that this plays out in a practical perspective. Number one, I would say, is don't try to be cool. This is a temptation. Again, this doesn't mean we can't play with children. Of course we can play with children. Of course we can connect with children. But if you're not into something, here's the key, I would say. If you're changing something about you for your child, not playing with them, humoring them, etc. If you are not into hip hop, let's say, but you get into hip hop in order to, so to speak, gain your child's what's the word I'm looking for? To be hip in your child's eyes, we're in the wrong direction here. And again, we tend to do this thinking that we're doing. Yeah, there we go. Gain your child's approval. Thank you, Busy. So we tend to think of this in terms of, oh, I'm doing this for my child because I want to be close to my child. That's yes, but your child needs you to be close to them, but not close to them like a friend. Your child needs you in the parental relation, in the parental role. Another thing I would say is people often give up their position as the leader of the household, right? They abdicate, if you will. Family meetings, for example, right? If you're sitting and having a conversation with your children, with your spouse, all together as equals, let's vote and decide, should we buy a house or not? Which shul should we attend? There's a certain lack of parental leadership that your children are looking for that's completely, that they're going to be craving as they grow, and that's actually going to lead to their harm. It feels good in the moment. It feels like, oh, I'm giving my child a voice, etc., right? But let's take that to some more extreme scenarios, right? Let's just have a conversation with the child. What would you like to eat for dinner tonight? Trust me, I can tell you what they want to eat for dinner. It's Pringles and Gushers. Of course, that's what they want, right? It's our job, just like it's our job as parents when it comes to physical health or physical well-being, right? We wouldn't have a conversation with our children. Should we run into the street now to get the ball or should we not, right? These are the obvious situations where we know we are the adult in the room and we should be taking that leadership role, right? I think the same thing is important when it comes to moral choices. And this is perhaps most important in terms of how the children should be acting in that same role. right? So we have to be able to teach our children that there's a certain divide between us and them. And as we start to set that tone, that leads to a healthy relationship between parents and children in everything else. For example, using a pleasant tone of voice, which means that you walk into the house, you open the cupboard, right? You see, not you, I'm talking for the child here, right? A child walks into the house, opens the cupboard, and sees something on the shelf and doesn't see the food that they want on the shelf. It's not a statement. You don't scream, there's never any food in this house. There's nothing wrong with walking over to your parent and in a pleasant voice. This is the difference between a child talking with respect, with a certain amount of distance, or when we level the playing field and we say, no, we're all in this together, right? To a parent, we use a pleasant voice. We ask questions. We don't make statements, etc. And this can be done in many ways, by the way. Nobody is saying, for starters, it's almost never useful to say to your parent in the moment, that's not a respectful way to talk to your parent. But for example, let's say a child needs something and they say it in an unrespectful way. We can give it to them because we know they need it now, whatever it is. And then an hour later, walk over to them and say, by the way, let's talk about what happened earlier when you were very hungry and when you were there. Do you think that was a respectful way to talk to your parent? I think there's a more respectful way to talk to them. What do you think a more respectful way? And we can guide them through that. Another way that's commonly spoken about, one that we use in our household, is modeling, right? Child says, there's never any food in this house. You can just walk over to them and show them the right way to say that. Mommy, I wanted there to be rice cakes on the shelf. Can we please buy some more rice cakes for the house? Teaching a child in multiple ways, and there's lots of ways to go about this. But the idea is showing them that there's modeling for them and leading the way in terms of having a relationship with them where there's a certain amount of distance between the parent and the child. Obviously, this is the same thing about not ordering a parent around, which means if a child wants something, they can ask the parent to do it, but they cannot tell the parent what to do. You're not your child's aid. Very often we feel that way and we make jokes about that between parents, but it's important that the children know that we're here to help them. We're their parents and we will do things for them, but we're not here. A common example of this is, say your child is doing their homework at the kitchen table, right? And seeing you approaching, they say, Dad, can you please bring me a pencil? That's probably not so disrespectful. Why? They're asking nicely. You're walking right by. They're sitting. No problem. You can read them the pencil. But if everyone's sitting at the dinner table, including the mom, right, and your child asks you to bring them a spoon, and often we're tempted to just do it. Why? Because my child needs a spoon. I want to eat their dinner. Here's a spoon. Move on. It's the easiest way. But this is a teachable moment. Do you know where the spoons are? Yes. You need a spoon? Why don't you get up and get up and go get a spoon? Obviously, so somebody asked in the chat. It didn't fit in right now as we're having the conversation. Somebody asked in the chat about verbal abuse, right? Obviously, it's important to make sure we're talking to our children in a respectful way, honoring the relationship here, etc. So we don't look at them and say, "I'm not your slave," right? That's not the proper way to say it. But there are proper ways to teach our children. Now, again, if your child is 6 months old, needs a spoon, they're not going to ask for a spoon. They're crying, then we can give the child the spoon. But the moment the child is 2 or 3 and actually can get the spoon on their own, it's up to us to show them that the relationship here is a different one. And I think, by the way, that the biggest one of all of these, and where it becomes really the most teachable moment, is in teaching a parent, is in teaching children how to correct a parent in a respectful way. In other words, being able to look at the parent and say to them, instead of saying, "Oh, you're wrong, you got it wrong," instead of saying things like that, they should be able to look at the parent and say, "Didn't you teach us? Didn't you say to us X, Y, Z? Isn't the right thing?" In other words, there's a respectful way to teach, to correct. Even if a child needs to correct the parent for whatever way, for whatever reason, there's a proper way to correct it. And text 10 is directly from the Shulchan Aruch, from the Jewish Code of Law, of how to do this. One of the Shebis want to read for us? Matt or Beth? Text 10. We're on page 13.
If one sees his father transgressing, he must not say, "You violated a Torah commandment." Rather, he should say, "Father, does not the Torah say such and such?" The tone should be that of a question, not of an admonishment. The father will thus understand that he erred, but will not be humiliated.
And there's a way to teach our children this. There's a way to There's a certain amount of language we can tolerate from our children and other language that shouldn't be tolerated. In other words, we have to, whether in the moment, sometimes it's not in the moment, because we have to recognize that, okay, the child was in a bad mood, hungry, tired, etc. We're the adult in the room. We can make that decision. But later on, a conversation can be had. That wasn't a respectable thing to say. Dad, you're not allowed to double park. Don't you always tell us you're not allowed to double park? Right? Mom, you're biting your nails again. You always tell me not to bite my nails. Right? All of these conversations, you see right away that the child has violated the first guideline that we mentioned above. Remember, questions, not statements. Possibly tone of voice inflection, at least the way I was saying it, as well. A child has to understand the rules of respect are not suspended when we make a mistake. And here, I guess here's the way I would put this last one and why it's so important. It's because I think in everyday conversation, most of us are okay with this. We're with this. We're here. But as we move on and we get into scenarios, like let's say, for example, we're playing a game with our children, or in the last one on the list here, we have made a mistake and we know we made a mistake, and the child is correcting us and correcting us. In those instances, sometimes that's where the playing field gets leveled, and we're like, hold on, I want to have a more equal relationship here. And it's important to maintain that the status of the fact that there's a parent and there's a child, and that relationship has to operate that way. So there's a proper way, even within that framework, to correct the parent. There's a proper way, even within that framework, to get down and play a game with the child and be silly with the child, while still maintaining, again, to be close, but at the same time to have that distance. I want to say something else, and somebody asked me a question like this to this effect in the chat. This is probably one of the hardest things to teach as parents, and the reason for that is because there's a very blurry line here between, are we doing this for my own ego? I'm the boss here. I say what I say goes, and that's why you can't talk to me that way, right? Clearly, there's a lot of ego pouring out here. And remember, the cardinal rule we discussed in the first half of the lesson is that parenting is supposed to be about the child. So it's important. So this becomes one of the hardest places to do that, because it's a very personal thing. I'm demanding respect for myself, right? So somebody asked me, for example, what's if a child asks me, why do I have to be respectful to a parent? That's a very hard question to answer objectively about yourself. But let me give you two ways that it's actually it comes across very powerful and very, very, very meaningful to a child. The first one is a much more common one, if it's the other spouse. So we catch the child talking to our wife, to our husband, in a disrespectful way, right? We can interject and say, hold on a second, that's not a respectful way to talk to your father. That's not a respectful way to talk to your mother. And again, either in the moment or later, depending on where the emotions are, whether our children need to eat, need to sleep, etc. And I think that then we can have a much more objective conversation. Why do we need to be respectful? So then we can go back to text 12, right? Text 12 is you have to respect your parents, and we say it's in the 10 Commandments. And if you start to go into the rabbinic commentary on that, which I didn't do at the time, but now that somebody brought it up, I will. One of the commentary, which is the Chinuch, who goes into the rationale behind these mitzvot, he explains that the reason we're supposed to respect our parents is because they gave us the ultimate gift of life. Our parents brought us into this world, and just as we are obligated to have hakaras hatov, which means recognition of good that anyone gives us, right? So I can give an example if we're talking about a very young child, you say, hold on a second. I always teach you have to be thankful to other people, right? Why do we have to be thankful to other people? Why do we have to say thank you if someone gives us a candy, if someone gives us a ride, etc.? Why? Because we're appreciating other people. The ultimate appreciation is to our parents. Our parents brought us into the world. Our parents were given the obligation to raise us by Hashem, by the very dint of the fact that He gave this soul to this person to be entrusted with it, and therefore we have to have a respect towards that parent. And this is why I gave my first introduction. But that's a very hard thing to say without feeling a little egotistical or without letting your ego get in the way if you're talking about yourself. But if you're talking about your spouse, that's a much easier thing to do. And I promised I was going to give two examples of good ways to teach this type of behavior. The second one I would say is by modeling. If we have parents, and it's much harder, we're adults, and it was brought up earlier that it's much harder to have that kind of respectful relationship, etc. But imagine the message that we send our children. If we're we went to visit grandpa's house, right? And a pen falls down on the floor. And grandpa's about to bend down. Grandpa meaning our parent is about to bend down. And we say, no, dad, I'll get it for you. And you pick it up. The message that we send our children is so powerful, right? We come to grandpa and grandma's house, and there's no space at the dinner table. There's only one seat available. That seat is grandpa's seat. And you ask your child, hey, could you move over a little bit so I can sit here? And he says, why can't you sit right there? Well, that's grandpa's seat. I don't sit in my father's seat. I don't call my father by his first name, right? All of the examples that we gave, when we model the behavior to our children, they start to see this behavior, and culturally it begins to become a part of the way things are in the home. I will say, by the way, that this is usually only a struggle with the first child. Because the moment that the second child is there, trust me, the first child will enforce the rules for the second child. They'll teach your second child that you can't call your parent by their name, or you can't say, oh, that's Tati's seat, now let us sit there, etc. Right? That they always like to be the leader in this regard. And if we model that behavior, then it starts to become part of the home, and then it trickles down into the rest of the family. And I want to conclude today's lesson. We're going to try to make it within 90 minutes each week. It looks like this week will be on time. Can't promise that every week is going to be that way. But I want to conclude today's lesson with a very, let's say two brief thoughts. Number one, parenting, when viewed from a Torah perspective, is a very, very daunting job. It's why we're all here, because we're all looking for tips. We're all looking to do a better job. And it seems like every time we go to a parenting lesson or a course or whatever it is, right, it only gets worse. Like, because we hear all the perfect things that we're supposed to do as parents, and we're like, hold on a second, I'm doing this wrong, I'm doing that wrong, I'm doing this wrong, I'm doing that wrong. And especially like a lesson like today, we give a whole attitude, and we're like, oh, that's not what my relationship with my child looks like, right? And I think it behooves us to remember the same point we mentioned all the way at the beginning. Earlier, we mentioned it as like an obligation. Hashem entrusted us with a child, and it's our obligation to take care of this child. But let's also remember it as a privilege. Let's remember that God, who actually knows us and knows who we are, the parts of us that even we ourselves don't even realize who we are, has entrusted us with this child that maybe is a little bit more challenging to guide in the right way, a child that maybe is a little easier to guide in the right way. But the perfect child that Hashem believes in us, that we can raise this child. There's a saying in the Talmud that goes as follows. It says, which means God doesn't give us an overwhelming task. Now, overwhelming is an interesting word. It doesn't mean he doesn't give us a challenging task. He's constantly giving us challenging tasks, but he never gives us anything that's outside of our parameters, outside of our abilities. And if he has given us something that seems outside of our abilities, it means that we have more inside of us to dig into, to actually be able to use to do this shlichut, to do this mission, this job that we're entrusted with raising these particular children. So that's very, very empowering. As we go about it and we realize the mistakes we're making, etc., and we think to ourselves, I'll never get this right. We have to remember, no, that's impossible. I could get this right because God gave me the strength that I need to raise, this particular child. And I think that brings us to the final thought that I want to share before we end today's lesson, which is there's a paradox in parenting. On the one hand, we need to get out of the way, allow our children to grow and thrive, right? We want our children to be independent. We want them to be able to learn on their own, right? We don't want to pick up the spoon for them. We want them to pick up the spoon. We don't want to tell them how to win the game of Monopoly that we're playing. We want them to learn how to win, right? All of the different things in life. And on the other hand, we need to be there for our children. We've been learning today. We have to be the parent. We have to be the guide, etc. I think the best way to reconcile this is to recognize we have to get our ego out of the way. We don't have to get out of the way and let our children grow up on their own. Even, and we'll talk about this in lesson 3, even when we're talking about independence, we don't have to get ourselves out of the way. As long as we get our ego out of the way, our children will grow up healthily. If we're still there, but we're there completely selfless, or as selfless as we could be that day, let's be realistic, right? Then what will happen is we'll be there and we'll actually be able to guide the child in the best way possible. We'll be in the picture, but out of the picture at the same time. And I'd like to conclude today by asking you each to fill out the following exercise. On page 14, we've learned 2 lessons today. Number 1 is we've learned selfless parenting. You don't have to do this now. You can do this after the Zoom logs out. but I want you to identify one way that you can modify your parenting approach to better accommodate your child's interests, specifically by getting out of the way a little bit. Identify one area where maybe you think, oh, my ego's involved there. And let's make that a goal, an exercise that we can try to work on this week until we meet again next Thursday. And the same thing for the second lesson that we learned. Let's try and identify one area in our relationship with our child. One behavior, one act, one moment. We don't have to change everything. We can still be, same parents with the same flaws and the same mistakes, but just fine. At the dinner table, that's when I'm going to work, whatever, or with getting dressed or whatever it is. That's where I feel that I'm not being enough of a leader, enough of the parent and the guide and the moral compass for this child. And I'm going to try and be more of the child's parent as opposed to their child. And if we can work on those two areas, then today's lesson will have been a major success. But this will conclude lesson 1. I want to take a moment to heavily recommend on page. Okay, you guys don't have this page yet. Okay, it's page 18. Maybe no, I don't think you have this page yet. Page 18 is a quote from a book that sits on my nightstand. By the way, it's a book I heavily recommend. I'll make a book recommendation. And I'll link it in. There's going to be a follow-up email to every single lesson, and I'll link this book on Amazon. It's by Rabbi Abraham J. Twersky, Rabbi Dr. Abraham J. Twersky. It's a book called Positive Parenting, and it's literally the Jewish approach to parenting. There's definitely going to be some quotes from him throughout the book. And he has this article called What is the Goal? And a lot of what we discussed today, the goal of parenting, being selfless parenting, et cetera, and being to raise children, all that sort of thing, and making sure to get our own ego out of the way, is discussed there. And he has a beautiful way of writing. It sits on my nightstand, and the words are like glittery, like when they do that. And my kids love that book. It's all glittery, etc. It's called Positive Parenting. I'll link it in the follow-up email. But they have one article from or one chapter from inside that book on page 18 of your textbooks when you all get them. And I really want to recommend reading that additional reading, if you will, at the back of the textbook. For now, I will bid you all a good night, and I will ask you to turn your attention to the video screens for a summary of today's lesson.
Key points, lesson 1. 1. Judaism has a proven successful parenting track record in the sphere of the religious and ethical, as well as the social, moral, and academic domains. Also, Judaism offers a time-tested parenting formula that does not go out of style upon the arrival of the next popular parenting theory. 2. Historically, Judaism has viewed parenting as a responsibility rather than a right. In past times, this view distinguished the Jews in various important areas of family law. Today, secular family law has largely come to reflect Jewish values in this area. 3. At times, we make parenting choices while, consciously or subconsciously, considering our own benefit and comfort rather than our children's. A cardinal rule in parenting is to question our every parenting decision. Is it good for me? Or is this good for my child? 4. Parents are, first and foremost, their children's role models and moral guides. A child needs and wants parents who behave like parents. Kids don't need their parents to be their friends. A parent's desire to be his or her child's friend does not result from considering the child's interests. 5. Parents need to establish their parental status and teach their children the proper way to respect them. This is done not only for the benefit of the parents, but for the benefit of the children.
Thank you all for joining us. This has been lesson 1 of the art of parenting. And I look forward to seeing you all next week, Thursday at 8:30 p.m. for lesson 2, parent, the noun and the verb. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks
Thanks,
so
Rabbi.
much.
Bye. Good night.
Have a good night, everybody. If anybody has any questions and they'd like to hang around, please let me know.